The silent twin, the soft voice behind Bee Gees classics, appeared to be Robin Gibb. However, FBI investigators were looking into murder threats against him in 1981. He began using a medication at the age of 17 that kept him up for days. He was prohibited from visiting his own children for 6 years and had more than 100 affairs by the time he was in his 30s. Even his closest friends were afraid of him because of his outrageous behavior. The world witnessed a gifted musician. They failed to see a man who was going totally crazy. Early on December 22, 1949, at 3:15 a.m., Robin Gibb was born. He got at the Jane Crookall maternity home on the Isle of Man 35 minutes ahead of his twin brother Maurice. In their family, that little moment would grow to be a cherished emblem. Maurice developed into a more lighthearted and laid-back personality, whereas Robin, who was always a step ahead, was frequently perceived as the calmer and more contemplative twin. While their mother, Barbara, fought through the protracted labor, their father, Hugh, hurried across the hospital floor. Even before Maurice breathed his first breath, Robin established the beat for the Bee Gees. The family subsequently joked. In post-war Britain, a difficult birth was no small feat, but both boys survived. Additionally, their entrance marked a significant beginning for a family that would forever alter the music industry. The Gibb boys were musically inclined from birth. Hugh, their father, was a drummer and bandleader who frequently performed in clubs around Scotland and England. His passion for performing infused their family, and although he wasn't famous, he was well known. Barbara sang with bands and had a lovely voice. Jazz sounds and rhythms filled the Gibb house at night, when most families were asleep. Even before they were able to speak, the boys heard this music. They absorbed it as they expanded. The music was always there, even if their parents didn't force them. There was more to this household than a record player. The foundation of the family was sound. The Gibbs were not always angels, though. They were regarded as troublemakers in Manchester in the middle of the 1950s. Robin, Maurice, and Barry got into all sorts of trouble. They set small fires throughout the area, broke into stores, and skipped school. They once burned a mailbox and a billboard. Their parents, who attempted to guide them in the proper direction, were ashamed, and the neighbors were alarmed by their behavior. Once, Robin was caught red-handed and dragged home by the ear. It was crazy, disorganized, and might have gone wrong. However, music quickly provided them with a greater focus than trouble. Marie Beck, a neighbor of Robin's, had a lifelong memory of a particular incident. Sitting in the living room was a boy, perhaps 8 years old, named Robin. "We're going to be rich one day," he declared abruptly. "We're going to start a band." At first, everyone chuckled. However, he meant it. His voice didn't sound like a joke for some reason. Marie frequently recounted that anecdote as the years went by and the Bee Gees began to fill radio stations all across the world. The truth had come from that young lad with lofty aspirations. The Gibb family's situation worsened in 1958. Hope was fading and money was scarce. Manchester was gloomy, cold, and teeming with conflict. So Barbara and Hugh took a risk. In order to start over in Australia, they packed up the family and enrolled in a government program. By water, the journey took about 2 months. They had only a few bags and hope when they landed at Redcliffe on September 1958. Even though everything was new, the dream felt more alive in some way. The people were gentler, and the sun was warmer. In a matter of weeks, the boys were singing while standing on the back of a truck at the nearby raceway. The crowds did not applaud. Coins were thrown. The lads collected money from the dirt track while dodging motorcycles. They were also getting paid to perform for the first time. Someone named Bill Good recognized something in them. He had a talent sense and worked at the raceway. Bill Gates, a DJ he introduced them to, assisted in giving them a new moniker, the Bee Gees. More significantly, though, Good gave them a chance to sign with Festival Records. Barry was only 17 years old in 1963. Maurice and Robin were just 13. Nevertheless, they were signed. They had to perform live in the rudimentary recording studio. They have to start over if they made a mistake. It didn't matter though. At last, they were inside. Even though their early songs were straightforward and unpolished, they had a unique quality. Their harmonies were beginning to take shape, and they were picking things up quickly. By 1966, things had deteriorated once more. Festival considered dropping them, but they toiled day and night in I. Barnes' small studio. Then everything was different. Barry's song, Spicks and Specks, struck a chord. It quickly rose to number 4 on the national chart, and in some locations, it even peaked at number 1. The Bee Gees appeared everywhere at once. That melancholy in the words, that eerie harmonies. There was nothing like it in the world. People did not forget it. It saved more than just their Australian career. They became famous as a result. Their faces were as popular as their music. They were adored by television. They made appearances on Cotty's Happy Hour and Anything Goes. They had permission slips from the school just to perform because they were so young. Now their manager, their father took them to rehearsals and drove them to sets. People in Australia started to recognize them by sight as well as name. No longer was the Bee Gees a band of mystery. Every week, they were the boys that everyone watched from their living rooms. Despite their widespread fame, they understood that Australia was just the beginning. They made the decision to return to England in late 1966. There was a significant risk. They were departing from a nation that had at last accepted them, and they had no contract in place. To be able to relocate, however, their manager assisted in severing their relationship with Festival Records. They set out on the clear skies on January 3, 1967. They reached Southampton on February 6. Their demos had already reached England without their knowledge. They were prepared when Barry entered Polydor's offices. They inked a 5-year pact in a matter of weeks. Robert Stigwood, their new manager, had ambitious intentions. The Bee Gees lived up to the hype that they were being marketed as the next big thing. New York mining disaster 1941 wasn't just another song when the Bee Gees released it on April 14, 1967. It was a silent blast. The public first heard Robin Gibb's shaky VBO on this eerie song. It was both their first American single and their first single abroad. Miners stranded underground, waiting for an unfulfilled light, were depicted in the lyrics. Every note in Robin's voice conveyed the loneliness and terror. The loud psychedelic pop that was then dominating the airways was not like this. The Bee Gees weren't just another band, as this song demonstrated. Robin was the one with the pen, and they were storytellers. It soared to the top of the US and UK charts, paving the way for all that came after. Robin had established himself as the voice of silent anguish in less than 3 minutes. In September 1967, a few months later, Massachusetts transformed that small tragedy into something much more significant. Once more, Robin's voice took center stage, but this time, it was softer and more melancholy. The song peaked at the top of 12 other nations and scored their first number 1 in the UK. What was odd was that none of them had visited Massachusetts before. It was more powerful in some way since they only imagined it. During a hectic week in London, Robin documented it. As a result, the song sold more than 5 million copies globally. Decades later, it remained popular, coming in 3rd place in a UK program on the group's greatest songs. When Robin sang it, the audience experienced a certain emotion. For the remainder of his life, he played it at almost every show. It wasn't merely a success. It became the hallmark of his voice, a warm, yearning tone. The band's sound was permanently altered in 1967 by another factor. There were 2 new musicians. Vince Maloney on guitar and Colin Peterson on drums. Colin discovered a new life in music after working as a child actor in Australia. Prior to becoming a full-time member of the band, he performed with Maurice Gibb. Robin's delicate voice was counterbalanced by Vince's gritty, bluesy sound. I Started a Joke in Massachusetts are 2 of his guitar-shaped hits. The Bee Gees were no longer only a trio after these 2 joined. They performed on shows like Top of the Pops and Ed Sullivan, turning into a 5-man operation. The sound of the group became tighter and bolder. They had years of hits thanks to that little addition, which helped start a successful streak. And then, there was a moment that only Robin could have had. He was listening to the quiet drone of the engines while he flew on a British Airways propeller plane. Robin made melody out of it, whereas most people would ignore it. I began a joke, and that continuous hum became the music. Later, he made a joke about telling the pilot to land so he could come to a pub and finish the song. The inspiration was real, but the story wasn't. The song, which was released in 1968, turned into one of his most moving performances. There was a hint of tears in Robin's voice. People everywhere were touched by the tenderness and melancholy. The song became a tribute to him after his passing in 2012. It was uncomplicated, eerie, and memorable. A lot of people started to notice that weird, shaky vibrato. Robin was previously said to as one of the greatest white soul voices ever by renowned music historian Paul Gambaccini. It was recognition, not merely praise. No one else sounded like Robin. It was honesty, not weakness, that made his voice waver and crack. Regardless of whether it was Massachusetts or my joke, he gave each line weight. It sounded as though his voice had endured everything it sang about. But there was a price for that voice. On 27 July 1968, Robin passed out. The band was getting ready for a big U.S. tour when he passed out. He was barely 18. Despite the fact that nervous weariness was frequently used as a nice term to describe mental and physical burnout, doctors diagnosed him with it. He was exhausted from the constant pressure, interviews, and performances. The tour was canceled and he was admitted to a London nursing home. It was more than a pause. It was the first concrete indication that the pressures of celebrity had gotten to be too much. Robin wasn't simply worn out, he was cracking. His recuperation wasn't easy. Robin relapsed after resting for a while. He needed to be transported back to Sussex this time so he could recuperate at home. Without him, the Bee Gees had to continue. Additionally, something was absent. The atmosphere in the studio shifted as a result of his absence from the recording sessions for their album Odessa. Barry and Maurice pressed on, but their relationship was beginning to deteriorate. In 1969, such tension increased. Barry and Robin started arguing about artistic decisions. Out of all the fights, one stood out. Lamplight by Robin was selected as the main single in Germany, although it was on the B-side of Barry's song 1st of May in the majority of other countries. It seemed like a betrayal to Robin. He thought that song was true. He interpreted its dismissal as evidence that his beliefs were no longer relevant. He made a choice in March 1969. He gave up. Even though Robin was only 19, the consequences were profound. His parents contemplated filing a lawsuit to have him declared a ward of court after rumors surfaced that he was doing narcotics. Adulthood in Britain didn't start until age 21. They thought he was becoming uncontrollable. The concern was genuine, but no formal action was taken. All of them had suffered from the strain, the loneliness, and the escalating strife. His last appearances with the Bee Gees were on The Tom Jones Show and Top of the Pops. Then he disappeared. Then came lawsuits. Contracts were contested. Even though his solo work was delayed, Robin persisted. He published Saved by the Bell in June 1969. It was well received. It peaked at number 2 on the UK charts by July 9. In addition, it peaked at number 3 in Germany and at the top of the charts in South Africa, Ireland, and New Zealand. Europe welcomed the lackluster response from the US. In order to demonstrate that familial ties had not completely dissolved, Maurice even performed on the track on the piano and organ. Additionally, Robin collaborated with other musicians. He co-wrote Only One Woman with Barry and Maurice for the band, The Marbles. In 1968, it peaked at number 5 in the UK and spent weeks in the top 10. He also contributed to additional tunes, such as The Walls Fell Down. Robin continued to demonstrate his limitless writing, singing, and creative abilities even while he was not with the Bee Gees. Nevertheless, the Bee Gees were severely impacted by Robin's absence. Maurice and Barry went on, but there was no magic. They struggled financially and played to nearly empty venues. Barry once acknowledged that he thought about giving up music completely and getting a conventional office job instead. Self-assurance waned. The funds ran out. It was the lowest period in their lives. In August of 1970, a change occurred. Robin returned. It wasn't an easy reunion. It required time, discussions, and the silent understanding that their strength lay in their solidarity. None of the three brothers could match their combined talent, despite their attempts at individual work. It was dubbed the magic of the three. They were considered British pop stars in the 1960s, but by the early 1970s, that reputation was rapidly eroding. In the US, their album Mr. Natural barely made it to number 178. Life in a Tin Can, another album, was a failure. They were frequently referred to as Beatles' imitation by critics, and there didn't appear to be a clear path back. Then, in 1975, things changed drastically. Under the direction of producer Arif Martin and with encouragement from Eric Clapton, the brothers relocated to Miami. A new music culture full of energy, bass, and rhythm enveloped them as they began recording at Criteria Studios. A new sound was shaped in part by the shift in atmosphere. They combined Barry Gibb's falsetto vocal, which debuted prominently on nights on Broadway, with R&B, louder beats, and a crisp production. Their signature would eventually be that voice. The sound of their automobile tires hitting bumps on a Miami causeway served as the inspiration for their new song, Jive Talking. It rose swiftly to the top of the Billboard Hot 100. Main course, their record became a gold standard. Soon after, You Should Be Dancing followed, confirming that they had discovered a completely new sound. Longtime admirers were taken aback. Some were even disappointed. The Bee Gees did more than simply revitalize their career, though. They ultimately established the style for an entire musical generation. The Bee Gees had no idea what was in store when Robert Stigwood invited them to compose music for a brand new movie called Saturday Night Fever. The movie was far into its production by 1977. Not even the audio was complete. The brothers wrote 5 songs in a few days after locking themselves in a French chateau. Staying Alive, Night Fever, How Deep Is Your Love, More Than a Woman, and If I Can't Have You, sung by Yvonne Elliman, were among those tunes. An entire period would be defined by these songs. Writing wasn't the only thing they did. The entire soundtrack's creation was influenced by their sound. The outcomes were enormous. The successful song Staying Alive became more than that. Later on, its 103 beats per minute was utilized to teach CPR timing. For 8 weeks, Night Fever topped the Billboard Hot 100. Between 1977 and 1978, 4 of the Bees' compositions peaked at number 1 in the United States. These were If I Can't Have You, How Deep Is Your Love, Night Fever, and Staying Alive. That had never been done by any other team. There was urgency and promise in the tunes. Millions of people could relate to the sentiment expressed in the lyrics. They performed outside of clubs as well. The world was captivated by it. The November 1977 release of the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack marked a turning point in culture. Prior to Michael Jackson's Thriller, it was the world's best-selling album. Over 40 million copies were sold worldwide. It was 16 times platinum certified in the US alone, and it held the top spot for 24 weeks in a row. For 120 weeks, it remained among the top 200 on Billboard. By early 1979, it had sold 1.97 million copies in France, and by 1981, it had surpassed 2.1 million. In 1979, it took home the Grammy for Album of the Year. Because of its cultural significance, the Library of Congress added it to the National Recording Registry. This wasn't simply another hit for the Bee Gees, they became world famous as a result. They had evolved beyond being musicians. They served as disco's faces. They had the sound of the late 70s. Bee Gees Records wasn't the only place Robin Gibb visited. He co-wrote hits for other well-known musicians with his brothers. They collaborated with Barbra Streisand on her Guilty album in 1980. Woman in Love became her biggest worldwide single and topped the US charts for 3 weeks. Additionally, Robin contributed to the duets Guilty and What Kind of Fool. They wrote Islands in the Stream for Dolly Parton and Kenny Rogers in 1983. Originally intended for Marvin Gaye, its final version became a #1 smash on the other side of the Atlantic. "I missed you," he said. He was still in shock that Maurice was no longer there. That pain never left Robin. He discussed upcoming trips with Barry and Maurice even when in a coma. It never occurred to him that he might die. He played at his funeral and questioned, "How deep is your love?" It was his last farewell, that music and those words. He never stopped thinking about the brother he lost. Ultimately, he was not defined by his songs, scandals, or celebrity. The pain that never went away was love.